Texas, 1944. The first light of dawn crept across the plains, painting the dust outside Amarillo in pale gold. The convoy groaned to a halt, engines coughing their last breaths before silence took over. Only the chirring of cicadas and the restless whisper of wind through mesquite trees filled the air. In the back of one truck sat a dozen German women, prisoners, not warriors. Their khaki uniforms hung loose from weeks of transport across continents and seas. Among them, 24-year-old Lisa Lotta Minhart, once a Luftwaffe radio operator captured near Cherbourg, stared at the horizon with hollow eyes. She had imagined America as a furnace of vengeance, a land of iron cages, cruelty, and humiliation. Every rumor back home had painted the same picture, that the Allies beat their captives, made them dig their own graves, and laughed as the desert sun scorched their backs. When the truck doors finally clanged open, Lisa Lotta braced herself for barking orders for the rifle's crack against bone. But instead came a voice, slow, measured, almost gentle. "Ma'am, watch your step." A man in a sweat-stained tan hat waited below. His sleeves were rolled, boots coated in dust. Not a soldier, not a jailer. He looked like someone who had ridden straight out of an American film, a cowboy brought to life. Behind him, the Texas sky opened like an ocean of blue, so wide it made her dizzy. The air smelled of hay and horses, not smoke or fear. Around her, the other women climbed down hesitantly, clutching their small canvas bags. There were soldiers nearby, yes, but they leaned on their rifles lazily, their faces calm, unthreatening. The cowboy offered her a tin cup filled with water. It was cold, impossibly clean. She drank until it was empty, half expecting it to be her last comfort. He nodded. Plenty more where that came from. Lisa Lotta didn't know what to say. Back home, they'd been told Americans were savages, a nation of criminals who worshipped machines and money. Yet here, beneath the soft warmth of a Texas morning, that image shattered. Beyond the fence, cattle grazed without hurry. Windmills turned slow circles in the distance. A dog barked at its own shadow. "You'll be working over there," the man said, pointing toward a stable. "Feeding, cleaning, maybe riding if you're up for it." "Riding?" She almost laughed. She'd expected shackles, not saddles. When the gates closed behind them, Lisa Lotta turned once more toward the open plains. For the first time since her capture, a spark replaced the dread inside her. It wasn't hope, not yet, but curiosity. She whispered under her breath, as if testing the words. This is America." The screen fades and the narrator's voice cuts through. She had been taught to fear a monster, yet what she found was a nation so sure of itself, it didn't need to hate its enemies. A land where prisoners were handed reins instead of chains. Before stepping onto American soil, Lisa Lotta had been certain she would die there. Everyone she knew had believed the same. Nazi propaganda had made sure of it. Posters screamed warnings from every wall. Captured Germans will be tortured, starved, or used for experiments. Radio voices described America as a decaying empire, a place where greed had replaced honor and freedom had rotted into chaos. For women, the terror was deeper. Rumors in the Luftwaffe's auxiliary corps whispered of female captives being sent to labor camps or worse. Officers repeated the lies until they became gospel, that America was a land of machines and monsters wearing human faces. That fear stayed with her through the voyage across the Atlantic, through the endless railways that carved through the heart of the continent. Yet when the train doors opened in Texas, the nightmare dissolved into something almost impossible. Kindness. The guards offered food. They said, "Please" and "Thank you." It felt unnatural, like a trap. But it wasn't. What America had, the Reich could never manufacture: moral confidence. By 1944, the United States had become the world's largest keeper of prisoners, more than 400,000 Axis soldiers and civilians held across its soil. But instead of crushing them, the U.S. followed the Geneva Conventions with surgical precision. Prisoners were paid small wages, allowed letters, prayers, even English lessons. And in Texas, where the horizon never ended, they were sent to ranches, not cages. It wasn't sentiment, it was logic. The war had taken millions of young men overseas. Someone still had to plant, to harvest, to herd. German prisoners filled the gap. Yet to Lisa Lotta, this pragmatism felt like mercy. That first night, she sat before a plate of food she thought was a trick. Beef stew, buttered bread, and a slice of apple pie. She couldn't touch it. Another woman whispered it was poisoned. But by morning, hunger beat suspicion. They ate. And in that moment, every myth unraveled. The enemy they'd been told to despise had fed them better than their own army ever had. In her first censored letter home, Lisa wrote, "They said we'd be slaves, but the guards here say good morning. The sky is endless, and the food tastes of mercy." For women raised under dictatorship, the true shock wasn't the comfort, it was dignity. America didn't need to humiliate to assert power. That quiet assurance would soon begin to dismantle everything they'd believed about the war. By the spring of 1944, the country had turned into a continent of orderly prison cities. Over 70 camps stretched across Texas alone, from El Paso to Huntsville, neat rows of barracks, mess halls, and workshops built in weeks. But what made them extraordinary wasn't the wood or the wire, it was the philosophy. Unlike the brutal compounds of Europe and Asia, these American camps weren't designed to break men, but to manage them through decency. The strategy was simple, even coldly practical. A well-fed prisoner caused fewer problems, needed fewer guards, and when the war ended, he'd return home carrying a message louder than any leaflet. America didn't need cruelty to prove it had won. Each camp in America functioned like a miniature world of its own, a quiet city surrounded by wire and wind. Inside those fences stood libraries filled with donated German and English books, infirmaries that smelled faintly of soap and clean linens, and workshops where prisoners stitched uniforms, repaired boots, and built furniture. There were even orchestras and theater troupes that performed under the hum of cicadas, their music floating over the barracks at dusk. To outsiders, it looked absurd. Enemy soldiers living with comfort and art while war raged overseas. But to American strategists, it was psychological warfare, crafted not with bombs, but with civility. When the War Department began receiving captured German women in 1944, mostly nurses, clerks, and auxiliary Luftwaffe personnel, they faced an unexpected question: what to do with them? The answer was Texas. Its open spaces, endless sky, and desperate need for farm labor made it a perfect experiment in prisoner management. Most of these women passed through Camp Hearn or Camp Swift, sprawling compounds bordered by wheat fields and mesquite. The rules were simple: obey, work, and you would be treated fairly. Break that trust, and confinement awaited. But for the most part, the system ran on mutual understanding. Assignments varied as widely as the Texas plains themselves. Some captives picked cotton under the scorching sun, others sorted vegetables, milked cows, or repaired machinery. The women were often sent to ranches, to cook, to mend, to tend livestock. To them, it felt like stepping into another world, one that defied everything they'd been told. Americans trusted their prisoners with tools, with animals, even with unsupervised freedom. To the ranchers, this was simple necessity. With so many men gone to war, hands were scarce. But to the women, it was revelation. The propaganda that had painted America as a soulless, corrupt machine collapsed before their eyes, replaced by a strange vision of discipline, wrapped in kindness. Even their meals told a story. Each prisoner received over 3,000 calories a day: beef, potatoes, bread, vegetables, sometimes fruit, and always coffee when possible. To women who had survived on thin broth and ration cards, this was abundance beyond imagination. Everything in the camp ran like clockwork. Trains brought food, trucks hauled laundry, supply lists were filed and checked with military precision. The same nation that could build tanks and bombers in unthinkable numbers also managed to feed its captives with flawless efficiency. Lisa Lotta Minhart recorded her awe in a diary smuggled between the pages of a hymn book. Every crate, every meal, every uniform fits into a plan. Nothing is wasted. They build their world like a machine that never sleeps. In time, she would come to see that machine up close, not in the factories of Detroit or the shipyards of California, but on the sprawling ranch lands of Texas, where it merged with something even more bewildering: the effortless generosity of ordinary Americans. The morning the trucks arrived, the air was sweet with hay and dust. The sun hung low, cutting long ribbons of gold across the fields as guards read names from a clipboard. Lisa Lotta stood among 24 other women, her uniform faded but neatly pressed. None of them knew what awaited beyond the gate, only that they had been chosen for a work assignment at a local cattle ranch. Rumors had painted dark pictures: endless fields of forced labor, chains and barking sergeants, women vanishing into the desert. But as the trucks rattled through the open gates, their fears met an unexpected sight: men in wide-brimmed hats leaning casually against pickup trucks, their laughter carried by the wind. Cowboys, real ones. At their head stood a tall man with a sun-creased smile. "Morning, ladies," he called, tipping his hat. "Y'all ready to work?" His accent was so thick and cheerful that the interpreter had to repeat the words twice before they understood. When they reached the Callahan Ranch, the shock deepened. Instead of fences topped with wire, there were open pastures stretching to the horizon, dotted with grazing cattle and horses shimmering under the sun. The first order of business wasn't punishment, it was breakfast. The scent of sizzling bacon and coffee drifted through the yard. Cast-iron skillets hissed as eggs fried beside golden biscuits. The women sat around a long wooden table, silent, dazed, and waiting for the command to stand or salute. None came. No guards loomed behind them. No one shouted. After breakfast, Frank Callahan led them toward a corral. Horses stamped and snorted behind the rails, saddled and waiting. "You'll be learning to ride," he said with an easy grin. "Can't herd cattle on foot. Y'all are helping us drive 'em in next week." The women exchanged nervous laughter. "He's joking," Lisa whispered, but he wasn't. Within minutes, the cowboys were pairing each woman with a horse, using broken German and exaggerated gestures to explain the basics. The corral filled with chaos: shrieks, tangled skirts, slipping saddles, and one terrified mare galloping in wild circles. The ranch hands laughed, but not cruelly. They helped each woman back up, dusted her off, and tried again. "Don't fight her," one cowboy drawled. "Just feel the rhythm. She'll carry you if you trust her." By noon, the air shimmered with heat and laughter. The fear that had clung to them for months began to melt away under the Texas sun. For the first time since their capture, they were outside the fences, without rifles at their backs. When Lisa finally managed to guide her horse into a gentle trot, the motion filled her with something she'd forgotten existed: freedom. Not political freedom, not the hollow kind from speeches, but a quiet, personal one. The feeling of wind in her hair, dust beneath her boots, and the vast, endless sky above her. That night, back in the wooden bunkhouse built for ranch workers, she wrote by lamplight, "They trust us. It is madness, or perhaps kindness disguised as madness. They treat us not as enemies, but as people. I do not understand this America." Her confusion was universal. Every woman in that barracks felt the same. They had grown up in a world where power meant domination and obedience was survival. Yet here, strength looked like calm authority, patience, and good humor. Even the cowboys led differently. They didn't command through shouting or fear. When a horse refused to move, they didn't strike it. They waited, spoke softly, and tried again. Leadership through respect, not terror. Confidence without cruelty. It was the kind of strength Lisa had never seen before, and it was beginning to change her. Lisa Lotta watched it all unfold with quiet astonishment. If this was the America they had fought against, then everything she'd ever been taught about the enemy was a lie. The change didn't happen overnight. It crept in like dawn, soft, gradual, unnoticed, until it filled every corner of their days. Within a week, the German women found themselves treated less like prisoners and more like ranch hands. Their only guards were the wide Texas skies, the endless wind whispering through mesquite trees, and the steady eyes of cowboys who spoke with a rough courtesy that disarmed suspicion. There were no fences, no towers, no chains, only invisible boundaries drawn in trust. Frank Callahan had explained it simply the first day. "You run, you'll die thirsty out there," he said, tipping his hat toward the horizon. "You stay, you'll eat well and sleep easy. We're not your jailers, ladies. We're your neighbors till this war's done." Lisa hadn't believed him. None of them had. But by the end of that first week, doubt was impossible. The supply trucks came once every 7 days, and no one counted heads. The women could have vanished into the plains at any time, but they didn't. Why would they? Out here they had work, laughter, and a strange new sense of purpose. They mended fences and milked cows. They hauled hay and fed horses, moving with the same precision they'd once given to the factories back home. The cowboys watched with a mix of humor and admiration. "Tougher than half the boys we hired," one remarked, "and they don't complain neither." But what struck Lisa most wasn't the work. It was how different the Americans seemed to view it. In Germany, labor was duty, a burden to be endured for the fatherland. Here, it was pride. The cowboys joked, sang, and turned every chore into a friendly contest. Who could rope faster, mend longer, or finish before sundown? Evenings brought another shock. Instead of being locked away, the women were invited to sit by the fire. As the sky turned crimson, harmonicas and guitars emerged, their notes carried by the warm Texas air. At first, the German women kept their distance, sitting stiffly in silence. But music has a way of dissolving walls that politics can't. One night, a cowboy began to hum Lily Marlene, the song every German soldier had once whispered at the front. Lisa froze. Before she realized it, she was singing softly, her voice trembling into the chorus. The men joined in, blending English and German into one fragile harmony. For a few minutes, the war disappeared. There were no victors, no captives, only human beings gathered under the same stars, sharing the same song. When it ended, Frank leaned back on his saddle and said quietly, "War ends sooner when folks realize they were never that different." The next morning, work resumed, but something had shifted. Suspicion had melted away, replaced by a lightness that none of them could explain. One of the women, Anna, asked shyly if she could learn to use a lasso. The cowboys obliged, teaching her with exaggerated patience and laughter. Before long, the sight of a German prisoner swinging a rope through the air became a running joke, laughter echoing from both sides. But the real test came one afternoon when the sky turned black without warning. A storm rolled in from the west, a wall of thunder and wind that swallowed the horizon. Lightning cracked, and the cattle panicked, scattering across the open fields. Without waiting for orders, the women grabbed ropes and saddles, racing into the chaos. Rain stung their faces as they rode through sheets of water, shouting, waving, driving the terrified herds back toward safety. Horses slipped, mud churned, thunder roared. yet none of them fell back. Hours later, soaked and trembling, they returned together, every animal accounted for. Frank walked among them, his face streaked with rain and pride. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, grinning. "Guess y'all ain't just city girls after all." That night when they returned to the bunkhouse, a hand-painted sign hung above the door. "The German Cowgirls." Lisa stared at it and then laughed until tears came. Something inside her, something long frozen by fear and propaganda, cracked open. The war, the slogans, the hatred, it all felt distant now, irrelevant under this enormous sky. What mattered was work, trust, and the rare dignity of being seen as human again. In a world torn apart by war, that trust was more precious than gold. By early autumn, the Texas air began to cool, and with it, the walls around their hearts. The war still burned across Europe, but here, time seemed to move at its own pace, slower, gentler. Days were filled with honest labor, nights with soft laughter and the hum of crickets beyond the windows. Then came the announcement: mail was permitted. Each woman was handed a single sheet of official camp stationery, a pencil, and the right to write one letter home. Every word would be censored, but even so, it was a chance to touch a world they'd almost forgotten. That night, the bunkhouse was silent except for the scratching of pencils on paper. Lisa's hand trembled as she began. "Dearest Mother, I am alive, and I must tell you something you will not believe. I am working on a farm in Texas. They call it a ranch. The people here are kind, yes, truly kind. We have food, so much food that I cannot eat it all. They let us ride horses. The men wear hats as wide as dishes and drink something called Coca-Cola. They play music after work and teach us their songs." She stopped, staring at the words. Would her mother think she'd gone mad? Back home, they'd been told that Americans starved and beat their captives. But here, in this sun-washed corner of the world, she drank coffee each morning and was learning to make chili. "Mama," she wrote, "they trust us. We could run, but we do not, because we are free in all the ways that matter. I never thought freedom could look like this." The letters were collected the next morning, sealed and stamped with military precision. Weeks later, replies trickled back, trembling words filled with disbelief. "Lisa, are you sure? You must be mistaken. Perhaps you are dreaming. They would never treat prisoners so kindly." Her mother wasn't alone. Other women received similar replies, families who couldn't comprehend tales of open fields, laughter, and cowboys. To those still living through bombings and rations, such stories sounded like fantasies. Even the American officers reading the letters chuckled. "Y'all are writing fairy tales," one drawled. "Ain't nobody over there gonna believe you." But the truth was undeniable. Every sunrise, every meal, every small act of decency chipped away at everything they had once believed about power and mercy. They saw it in the food, eggs by the dozen, meat by the pound, sugar by the sack. They saw it in the machines, tractors roaring across endless fields, fueled by gasoline that never seemed to run out. They saw it in the people, men who bowed to no one and feared nothing. One evening, Lisa asked a cowboy why he treated them so well. He shrugged. "Lady," he said, "war's over for you when you get here. Ain't no use fighting ghosts." It wasn't forgiveness, at least not in the way most understood it. It was something quieter, steadier, a kind of mercy rooted in practicality, the sort of American grace that judged a person not by uniform or allegiance, but by effort. On a warm afternoon, a new truckload of prisoners arrived, this time men. They stepped down stiffly, their boots sinking into the dust, eyes scanning the horizon in disbelief. What they saw didn't make sense. German women, prisoners like them, walking freely from the barn, chatting and laughing with cowboys, sunlight flashing on the polished saddles of the horses they led. "This cannot be real," one of the men muttered in German. But it was. The sight cracked something deep within them. Years of fear and propaganda began to dissolve under the Texas sun as they watched their comrades ride across open pastures without chains, without guards. For the first time, captivity did not feel like defeat. It felt like the first breath after drowning. Slowly, the men joined the rhythm of ranch life, side by side with the cowboys who taught them to repair fences, throw ropes, and on cool evenings, to dance. By November, the Callahan Ranch had become an impossibility made real, a small, living pocket of peace in a world still consumed by fire. For Lieselot, it was more than survival. It was awakening. She began to understand that humanity could endure even in the shadow of war, that compassion could bloom where logic said it shouldn't. She didn't yet realize that these lessons, sown in dust, sweat, and laughter, would follow her for the rest of her life. By April 1945, spring had come to the plains. The air smelled of rain and newborn grass. Calves stumbled beside their mothers, and the horizon shimmered with life. But beneath the surface, unease rippled through every whisper of wind. News traveled faster than the clouds. Germany collapsing, Berlin surrounded, Hitler dead. Or so they said. At the ranch, the women worked as they always had, mending, riding, cleaning. But every glance carried the same unspoken question. That afternoon, Frank Callahan stepped into the barn, hat in hand, his expression somber. "Ladies," he said softly, "it's over." Silence fell like a weight. The word hung in the air, heavy and foreign. Over. Lieselot stared at him. "The war," she whispered. He nodded. Germany surrendered. Tools slipped from hands. Someone gasped. Anna covered her face and began to cry. For a long moment, no one moved. The world they had known, the one that defined every fear, every duty, every breath, was gone. The war was over. But what did that mean for them? That night they gathered around the fire, the flames painting their faces in gold and shadow. No one sang. No one spoke. The crackle of burning wood was their only prayer. Frank poured coffee, passing the tin mugs in silence. "It's done," he said quietly. "You'll be going home soon." The word home cut deeper than the news itself. Home. What was left of it? For many, it was nothing but rubble and ghosts. Lieselot stared into her cup, watching the sparks float upward into the vast, indifferent sky. "What will we go back to?" she murmured. Frank didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was too big for words. Days later, army trucks arrived. Officers in crisp uniforms called names from lists and handed out instructions. The women packed what little they owned, letters, gloves, a few keepsakes. As Lieselot folded her worn work gloves into a canvas bag, Frank approached. "Reckon you'll be heading home soon," he said, voice low. She nodded, unable to speak past the ache in her throat. "Thank you," she managed. Frank smiled beneath the brim of his hat. "Ain't nothing to thank me for. You did your part, worked hard. That's all any of us can do." Then, with a crooked grin, he held out a small brown parcel. "Got something for you." Inside was a brand new Stetson, soft cream leather, smelling faintly of dust and saddle soap. "So you don't forget Texas," he said. Lieselot laughed through tears as she placed it on her head. The ranch hands cheered. Someone whooped, "Yee-haw! The German cowgirl rides again." When the trucks finally rolled away, the women looked back through the slats, watching the ranch shrink into the horizon, the barns, the windmill, the waving hats. For Lieselot, that sight would never fade. She had arrived as a prisoner and was leaving as something entirely different, a woman who had glimpsed another kind of strength where dignity wasn't enforced by power but given freely through respect. As the truck bounced down the dusty road, she whispered to herself, "Maybe we lost the war, but perhaps we can still win peace. That realization stayed with her long after the Texas plains disappeared behind her. The voyage home was slow, months of waiting, sailing, processing. When she finally stepped off the ship at Bremerhaven, winter had returned. The air bit like knives, the city lay in ruins, and the gray sea moaned against the docks. This was homecoming, but to a homeland that no longer existed. American officers handed out small care packages, chocolate bars, canned meat, a Red Cross letter stamped with instructions. Lieselot turned one of the boxes in her hands, staring at the familiar red emblem. For years she had been told that Americans were monsters, cruel, greedy, without honor. Yet here she was, holding a Hershey bar, wearing a Stetson hat, and realizing that everything she had been taught was a lie. When she reached her village, the truth was even starker. Her home was gone. Her parents were gone. But within her, something unbreakable remained, the lesson of the ranch, the belief that kindness could rebuild what hatred had destroyed. She began working as a translator for the Allied occupation forces. Her English, rough, filled with cowboy slang and lazy drawl, made the officers smile. She'd call them partner, say ain't, and they'd laugh, shaking their heads. When asked where she learned, she'd grin and tell them about the ranch, the music, and the men who treated enemies like neighbors. Her stories spread about cattle drives, Coca-Cola, and the quiet decency of Texas. In 1948, she stood before a room of women in Stuttgart at a conference titled Rebuilding Through Understanding. Facing both Germans and Americans, she began, "I was a prisoner of war, but I never felt like one." She told them about Frank Callahan, about the ranch hands who shared their food and their laughter, and about the day she wore her first Stetson and felt equal for the first time in her life. "Freedom," she said softly, "isn't given by nations. It's given by people, one act of kindness at a time." The hall was silent when she finished, then rose to its feet in tears. An American woman crossed the room and embraced her. Enemies once, now sisters. Years later, Lieselot emigrated to the United States, settling in San Antonio, not far from where her captivity had turned into awakening. She opened a small bakery that blended her two worlds, apple strudel with pecan crumble, pretzels dusted with smoked salt. Above the counter hung a framed photograph, a young woman in a cowboy hat standing beside a tall rancher, both smiling shyly. Beneath it, the words read, "From enemies to friends." When customers asked, she'd nod toward the photo and say, "That man taught me what America really means." When Lieselot died in 1987, she was remembered as more than a baker. She was a bridge, one of the first between former enemies who dared to believe in peace. Historians would later write that the quiet compassion shown to German prisoners helped reshape the world's image of America. Thousands returned home carrying stories of fairness, decency, and respect, small acts that built the first fragile threads of reconciliation. In the end, it wasn't treaties or speeches that began the healing. It was simple humanity. And on a Texas ranch in 1945, a cowboy with a kind heart did more to mend the wounds of war than any general ever could, because sometimes the greatest victories aren't won with guns or flags, but with grace, work, and the quiet courage to forgive.